What is up, YouTube family? Thank you guys for tuning back into Wilburn Reactions. So there, it was a topic that came up when I reacted to the 70s and 80s disco era like hits that we react to. And a lot of you guys, I was like, well, I don't know these artists. And a lot of you guys said, don't do it. The disco era was short and did not last long, and it sucked. So I'm going into another documentary, and this is titled What Happened During the Infamous Disco Night. So I don't know if this is going to go into like detail of why disco sucked, why it didn't last so long. I hope it does, because I hear people say that a lot. I know I've heard some hits in the disco era, but now that I think about it, how long did the disco era last? You know, but let's see what goes on in this documentary here.
Today, the American disco craze of the 1970s is mostly remembered as a handful of tropes: a colorful lit-up dance floor, gold chains, big hairdos, bell bottoms, and that one move John Travolta does in Saturday Night Fever, where he points at something. But in the mid-1970s, disco presented a rare, legitimate mainstream challenge to the long-standing dominance of rock and roll radio. The resentment felt by rock fans came to a head on July 12, 1979, when a local radio station invited White Sox fans to attend a doubleheader and bring their most hated disco records, which would be detonated in the middle of the field.
Okay, so that right there just shows me, I don't want to use the term disrespect, because obviously if they said disco sucked, then nobody wanted to, like, you know, run with it. But I'm saying, could you imagine being a person who created or even seeing, because this is baseball, you're talking about nationally televised, right? And you're telling fans to bring their most hated disco album in there so it can be destroyed. Could you imagine being the creator, like one of those artists, and you see your album come out there and now it's about to be destroyed because they saying your album sucks? That is wild.
Games. This did not go as planned. Today on Weird History, we're taking a look at Disco Demolition Night, a local radio promotion that turned into a full-blown riot. But before we get started, remember to subscribe to the Weird History channel and leave us a comment telling us what other infamous concert mishaps you would like to hear about. Okay, time to grab a butane torch and some ABBA records. Depending on who you ask, the infamous Disco Demolition Night that took place at Chicago's Comiskey Park in July of 1979 was either the much-celebrated demise of the disco era, a shameful display of racism and homophobia, or just some drunk idiots blowing off steam. The story of Disco Demolition Night begins with a Chicago DJ named Steve Dahl. In the summer of 1979, disco dominated the music charts and the hearts and minds of many American music fans. A 24-year-old rock fan, Dahl was fired that year when his radio station made a switch to an all-disco format. After taking a job at a rival station, Dahl made his seething hatred for the disco format into his signature on-air bit, expressing his frustration by destroying disco records and blowing them up using sound effects. Along with his co-host Gary Meyer, Dahl built up a large fan base of rock-loving disco haters. The group, which counted themselves around 7,000 strong by July of 1979, came to identify themselves as the Insane Coho-Lips, or just Cohos for short, a title specifically selected because it was meaningless.
So not only do we have a disco destroying night, we got radio stations jumping on board with the disco destroying nights by destroying albums on their radio station. That is crazy. So what was it? Like, did disco come at the wrong time, or was it like because rock and roll was flooding the streets and then you got this news like era of music that's coming out and nobody wanted to, like, changing the style, changing the sound, and that just, you know, ruffled people's feathers, like, I don't want to deal with it? Or did disco just really, because like I said, reacted to some of those songs I reacted to from the 70s and 80s on that top hits I did. Some of those songs, a lot of those songs I knew, and they were good hits. So maybe it was just certain groups that were good and then other ones were terrible. Like, I'm a little lost here. Maybe I need to hear some bad disco songs.
This reflected the Coho's overall view of disco music, which they saw as vapid and gaudy dance tunes for snobs, as opposed to the more authentic blue-collar sound of rock. For example, in one memorable rant, Dahl railed against expensive three-piece white suits, the stereotypical uniform of the disco dancer. One disco demolition attendee later recalled in Chicago Magazine that his distaste for disco grew in part from feeling personally excluded from dance clubs. He didn't feel that he was thin enough or pretty enough to make it past the velvet ropes, as opposed to rock music where all you need is a black concert tee and jeans. maybe even just one of those. The Cohos had particular ire for rock musicians who had transitioned to a more disco-friendly sound. Rod Stewart's 1978 hit Do You Think I'm Sexy was a constant focal point for their rage. Eventually, solidarity and passion among the Cohos gave Dahl and Meyer the idea to hold an in-person gathering, because nothing brings people together more than a shared disgust. Coincidentally, at this same time, attendance at Chicago's Comiskey Park, home of the White Sox, was way down. The team was averaging just 16,000 fans per game, and the lack of enthusiasm was starting to seriously impact revenue.
Don't tell me the disco
This
night
gave
is going to
Mike
bring
Veeck,
fans.
the son of White Sox owner Bill Veeck, an idea. The Sox would invite the radio DJ who was gaining notoriety for destroying disco records on the air to come to the stadium during a doubleheader and blow up disco records in person. When the younger Veeck and some White Sox reps reached out to Dahl's home station, WLUP, The Loop, they were informed that Dahl had already been planning an in-person anti-disco event for a local mall. Despite what seems like a clear venue upgrade, Dahl wasn't sure about the idea of moving to a stadium. He feared that even with help from the Cohos, the Sox would fail to draw a big crowd, and he'd end up destroying disco records against an unimpressive backdrop. You do need a big audience to blow up your least favorite records. Otherwise, it's just kind of weird and sad.
I feel like this is making it even like worse for the disco era, because now you have a stadium that's, what he said, 6,000 fans, right, showing up for baseball, and then you add this disco night and these hosts from the radio station, and now you got fans coming out just for this moment. I feel like at this moment, if I'm a disco artist, like, and I'm making music, I think I'm leaving that genre and coming out with something else, because obviously the people don't want it, don't want to hear it, and they're destroying what you have created.
Dahl eventually agreed, though he apparently remained paranoid about not having a big enough crowd until the day of the event itself, which ended up being a July 12th doubleheader against the Detroit Tigers. Concerns about attendance were so intense, the Sox agreed to sell discounted tickets for what became known as Disco Demolition Night. Because WLUP was at 97.9 on the radio dial, admission was set at 98 cents, with the additional
98
requirement
cents?
that fans bring a disco record with them to destroy. The event became a victim of its own success. While Dahl had initially fretted about getting even 5,000 people to show up and watch him wreck a bunch of records, somewhere between 50,000 and 75,000 people turned out for Disco Demolition Night at Comiskey Park. However, the stadium only holds about 52,000 people at maximum capacity. You can see where this is going.
I hope we're not doing this again. So we just reacted to overcapacity, people, lives being taken from this. So let's not head down that lane. Hopefully they got it under control. Being at a baseball stadium, I hope they had the security, everything you needed to have to keep this crowd under control. That is a lot of people. You go from 6,000 fans to 55,000 over a demolition night is wild. They're not even there for the baseball game. They're not even there as fans. They're there to destroy disco albums because they hate them. I think it plays a part on a lot of things. You got the baseball players who don't have fans showing up. Now they show up for a disco night that has nothing to do with your sport. And then you have the disco people who created the music. Now your albums are being destroyed, and there's a sellout crowd. That is wild.
In fact, many of the problems that developed over the course of the evening might have been avoided if the stadium staff had been better prepared.
And
Mike
they're
Veeck
not.
recalled telling security on the morning of the game to prepare for as many as 35,000 attendees, only to have them laugh at his response. Thousands of fans were turned away at the gates, but many attempted to get into the stadium anyway by scaling the walls or otherwise sneaking in, leading to an overall chaotic scene. Traffic on the nearby Dan Ryan Expressway was reportedly tied up for hours throughout the afternoon and evening, like the Pope was in town. The first of the two baseball games started at 6 p.m., but the crowd was already getting riled up. Tigers pitcher Aurelio Lopez refused to even warm up during the first game, as fans had already started throwing records and fireworks onto the field.
That's
Just before 9
crazy.
p.m., with a full baseball game still to go, Dahl, Meyer, and a colleague, so-called looped rock girl Lorelei Shark, drove onto the field in a Jeep. Dahl, clad in military fatigues and a helmet, led the massive crowd in a loud and passionate chant of "Disco sucks." At this point, the first box of disco records was blown up, shooting flames into the sky and sending smoke and vinyl scattering across the field. Some witnesses report the flames reaching as high as 200 feet in the air.
What?
But most seem to agree that it was more like 30 feet.
Okay.
Regardless, that's arguably too much fire for a humble baseball game.
Right.
It didn't take long for pandemonium to break out entirely, and the scene became hopelessly chaotic. One vendor, named Dave Gabarek, recalled that a long-haired fan jumped out of the left field stands, ran across the outfield, and slid into second base before pulling the base up out of the ground and waving it around like a trophy. After that, as many as 5,000 to 7,000 fans rushed the field in an instant.
And why didn't I think this was going to happen? I mean, come on. I really thought I was going to be like, you know what? We should have learned from this. The Who had a situation. Luckily, nobody's losing their lives in this situation that I think. Hopefully, we don't get there. I pray we don't get there. But at the same time, it's like, you'd have thought, let's get the situation under control. But obviously, they didn't prepare to think like, oh, we're going to have this many people show up, But let's not prepare for the worst. Let's just think that only this amount of people are going to show up and prepare for that. I always say prepare for the worst in that situation. It's going to be a sellout crowd. Obviously, disco sucks. People don't like it. They're showing up. Then you're blowing up. Let's just start there. You're doing something chaotic with a lot of people. You think you're going to tame 55,000 people, 52, since the other 3,000, got turned away, supposedly. You're going to keep them tamed and under control with chaotic fireworks and flames and all this going down. Yeah, you thought wrong. And look what's going on. They are on the field tearing stuff up.
Those that couldn't make it out of the rafters started throwing the records they brought with them like frisbees, either onto the field below or just haphazardly into the air. Fans started pulling up bases, looting the dugouts, ripping up the batting cages, and even lighting small fires, though some of these were later attributed to fireworks. Still, seems like too much fire for a White Sox game. One witness even claims to have seen fans tearing urinals off the walls in the restroom. What are you going to do with a souvenir urinal? White Sox
That's disgusting.
Craven, who was warming up for the second game, recalled seeing records, shoes, beers, and other personal items flying over his head and onto the field. After an hour and 16-minute delay, umpire Dave Phillips declared the field unplayable, and the White Sox were forced to forfeit the second game. To give you an idea of how extreme that was, no American League team has forfeited a game since. They'd play through an alien invasion, as long as the field doesn't get too wet. Fans continued rioting and ripping up the field long after announcers pleaded with them to return to their seats and restore some kind of sanity. White Sox announcer Harry Carey tried coaxing the crowd back into their seats, and even serenaded them with Take Me Out to the Ball Game. But nothing seemed to quell the storm of anti-disco rioting. Maybe if you'd tried something with a deeper, funkier bass line.
You can't stop
Chicago
the disco
police
hate.
took over crowd control and started making arrests. 39 people in total were taken into custody, mostly on charges of destruction of property. Luckily, only a few minor injuries were reported.
I mean, like, this is where I say, do you think that's fair? Do you honestly think that's fair? Let's eat. Like, I get it, get the crowd under control, but I mean, me personally, we can all agree to disagree, but I feel like those 39 people shouldn't have been the only ones that, get arrested, I guess. Man, there's a million people on this field doing this. You're gonna get me out of the. I don't know. I just don't agree with that. Like, I get it, maybe arrest them, but I think I would release them. I don't think I'm giving them a ticket or destruction of property. Everybody was doing it. Just because you got caught, they say the saying like, you got caught doing it. But the whole freaking stadium's in the act of doing this. Arrest everybody. Heck, arrest the people who thought about doing this and blowing up albums on a baseball stadium field during a baseball game. I mean, it's logic behind this. Why would you want to do this during a baseball game?
Alternate spins on Disco Demolition Night were being offered almost immediately after the crowd had dispersed. The Chicago media declared it a mob scene, while Dahl celebrated it as a crowning achievement for the anti-disco movement, which had succeeded in its goal of bringing people back out to Comiskey Park. And the event did line up with the overall downturn in the popularity of disco, though it's hard to say for certain how much a local DJ blowing up records influenced the larger pop culture trend. The Bee Gees had their last #1 disco hit, Love You Inside Out, on July 9th, just 3 days before Disco Demolition Night. By August and September of 1979, new wave acts like The Knack and Talking Heads were starting to make inroads on the pop music charts. Even in Chicago, some of the same nightclubs that had been home to the exploding disco scene started featuring more synthesizers and favoring what would later become known as house music, also known as music played by people in helmets. And it seems fair to say that groups like The Clash and Blondie had more to do with the popular resurgence of rock music than Steve Dahl and his one-off stadium stunt. In fact, rather than receiving any kind of
Steve Dahl's
credit for
like he had a
moving the
lot
country away from the sounds of disco in the 70s, Dahl ended up taking a lot of cultural blame for fashioning himself as an anti-disco figurehead. Dahl stated that his critiques of disco music were all class-based. In his mind, rock was the people's music, telling relatable stories about everyday life in America. And now it was being supplanted by nightclub music for wealthy people in big cities, symbolized by the elitism and hedonism of Studio 54 in New York City. But that image actually helps disco become mainstream in the U.S., fueled by a white heterosexual middle class seeking an achievable sophistication, partially as a reaction to rock and roll and the counterculture of the 60s. That demographic was different from American disco's origins in black and Latino clubs in the Northeast, its musical influences of funk, soul, pop, and salsa, and its popularity in the gay urban party scene. So, by leading a charge of mostly white male Chicago rock fans against it, some wanted to label Dahl and the event as homophobic and racist. In the ensuing years, he always denied that this was any part of his motivation. He insisted he just hated disco music, which is fair. Ever hear of Disco Duck? In an interview with reporter Tony Scalafani after Disco Demolition Night, I Will Survive singer Gloria Gaynor lamented that disco never fully got credit for being the first major American musical form to transcend nationality, race, creed, color, and age. Unlike the rock music that preceded it, to her mind, disco truly was for everyone, even ducks.
I feel like, so disco probably, I mean, it had to have fans, for it to at least have its little run. I don't know how long the run was. So that's the question I'll ask you guys, how long this disco run lasted. But there are some artists that I've seen that I, like I said, I reacted to previously on the previous video. And I saw some artists, a lot of artists I was familiar with and did not know that they fell in the disco category, and they were hits to me. So I would say, like you guys said, I know some of you guys said in the comment section, like, yeah, some of these guys, like these groups like Casey and the Sunshine Band, the Bee Gees and certain groups, were good, Donna Summer. But then you had some that you guys said one hit wonders, or people just trying to do something and just creating like just not good music. So maybe that's what it was. Maybe they just had bad artists in that, a lot of bad artists in the disco era. And that's what made that group, people say it sucked. But like I said, rock and roll was a genre that was just flooding the world. And I think, like I said, when you transform music or try to do something different, I always say my saying when I was taught up and brought up on my dad, I would say, if it's not broke, don't fix it. And I feel like that's probably what happened. You had rock and roll flooding and great music, and then this disco era came out and people probably were like, don't change it. But I mean, like I said, you can't take away from the artists that were good in that era of the disco era. You can't take away from those groups. And I feel like maybe now hearing this, I feel like maybe some of those artists were affected by it. Like they said, Bee Gees, their last album came like right after that, stadium incident. And maybe they were affected, but I think they were just too big. But maybe some of these artists that were in that era that were actually good were affected by the hate movement that was created, for the disco era. So maybe some of these artists that were really good, could have went a little bit further, or maybe even created some more albums and went further. But the hate disco era probably could have stopped them short. I don't know. I'm just going out on a limb here. I don't know if some of them kept going and, remained successful, but maybe they cut off some people that were good. But that's just crazy. I always hear about it whenever I do like react to disco or anything comes up disco. I always hear like, oh, this era sucks, don't do it, don't go down this lane. It's hilarious. So this is crazy to see, because I'm learning so much stuff behind the scenes from you guys, that events that went on, stuff that happened I've never heard about in my life. It's like watching the news and seeing something. It's like, it's crazy. These documentaries have been amazing, wild, and stories that it's like, if somebody told me this, I wouldn't believe it. I got to see it. That's how crazy these stories have been. It's like, nah, that didn't happen. They didn't do all that. You're making, you're adding to the story. There's no way the story was that. I feel like that's how these stories are. But thank you guys for dropping off another one. Let me know what you guys thought about this one. This one was wild. Keep dropping your suggestions down below. Sorry. My social medias are down below. Links. My email is down below. You can send whatever you want me to react to those links. Thank you guys as always. See you guys in the next one.